Hello, and welcome to What on Earth, the podcast of the Environmental Investigation Agency, or EIA. Wherever you are right now, and wherever you've been for the past 7 months, chances are that your life and those of all the people around you have been dramatically affected by the coronavirus pandemic. But while you've been in lockdown, so too have many of the world's environmental criminals. And the latest research from our wildlife investigators suggests that a lot of them have been working from home. I'm Paul Newman, EIA's Press and Communications Officer, and joining me today to discuss these findings is wildlife campaigner Rachel McKenna. Rachel, welcome, and thanks for taking the time to share your thoughts with us.
Hi Paul, thanks for having me on the podcast.
It's well documented that transnational wildlife criminals widely rely on shipping and air travel to do their business. So you'd think that anything which reduced international transport systems to a fraction of normal activity would necessarily have a knock-on impact on illegal wildlife trade. Has this actually happened?
Well, actually, Paul, our findings indicate that illegal wildlife trade has continued throughout and despite the pandemic. So, as you say, wildlife traffickers, they rely heavily on existing international transport and trade infrastructure to conduct their legal businesses. So now, what with the international travel sector in lockdown, with passenger flights down by approximately 95% at the height of the first wave of COVID-19, wildlife traffickers have had to adapt their modus operandi, their ways of operating, to adapt to the new normal, in essence. And I think the important thing to stress here is that illegal wildlife trade is still a problem, remains a problem even throughout coronavirus, even throughout lockdown. For example, as recently as last week, 626 kilos of ivory were seized in Cameroon, coming from the border in Gabon, highlighting that traffickers are very much active despite COVID-19 restrictions and travel lockdowns.
So your research shows that wildlife trafficking has continued despite the pandemic and indeed throughout it and the whole lockdown process of the world. Can you give us some idea how this has actually happened? How are they actually carrying on working as usual, and what the scale of the legal trade is like in comparison to, say, pre-lockdown levels?
Absolutely. So our seizure data shows that there's been quite a significant drop in reported seizures of illegal wildlife this year compared with previous years. So between January and July of this year, there were approximately 280 reported seizures worldwide. And this involves species such as elephants, so ivory, pangolin scales, leopards and tigers, including parts and derivatives such as skins, teeth, claws, bones, and also of rhino horn. So when you compare that number, 280 reported seizures between January and July of this year with January and July of last year, where there are a total of approximately 720 seizures, it's clear that COVID-19 lockdown restrictions have impacted smuggling dynamics in some way. And of course, the reduction in air passenger and cargo flights will have limited opportunities to smuggle via air, but there might also be other explanations for this reduction in reported seizures. And what I mean by this is that we can't really draw any inferences about the scale of wildlife trafficking from the seizure data that we have to hand alone, because a reduction in seizures may simply be due to the fact that there's decreased reporting of seizures as agencies at airports or at seaports, for example, and also media outlets, they switch their reporting emphasis on COVID-19 and other issues related to COVID-19 and not illegal wildlife trade. So this could potentially mean that the actual number of seizures may in fact be higher, or that the reduction could also be explained by limited capacity and resources on the ground at border points to conduct routine checks, meaning that goods may still actually be passing through, and they're just passing through undetected. So we don't exactly know, and we can't really draw too many inferences from the seizure data alone. But it is interesting nonetheless to note that there's been such a dramatic difference this year as compared with last year. And I think that's important to note because once international flights and the travel industry as a whole picks back up again, it's very likely that the transportation of illegal wildlife trade will pick back up again, will become easier. And it's really important that we monitor the situation as the pandemic evolves, to really see what the impacts are going to be, what the consequences are going to be.
What kind of illegal trade are we actually looking at in taking place during the lockdown? Is it largely business as usual across the board, and the kind of things that we used to look into and see in the press quite regularly, or are particular species being targeted, or maybe even some of them actually getting a reprieve from their usual exploitation? I mean, I'm thinking particularly, EIA ran several stories earlier this year based on our research concerning, say, for example, certain forms of traditional Chinese medicine using endangered species as among their ingredients and being pitched specifically as cures for or treatments for the virus. Has this been the case at all, or is it still the same species under the same hammer?
Well, so that's interesting. So this is another way in which, COVID-19 has been intersecting with illegal wildlife trade. And as you said, we've previously reported that certain traders have been claiming and promoting baselessly that endangered wildlife such as tiger bone and rhino horn can help to, quote, stay healthy, unquote, during the pandemics. And we've previously reported that authorities in China have touted bear bile injections as a potential cure for coronavirus. And as you say, it's been covered already in, I think, previous podcasts. So I'd encourage listeners to check that out on our website for more information. But I would stress that there are, our wildlife teams have been looking at data relating to specific species that as an organization, EIA works on as part of their campaigns. So it's important to note that COVID-19 may be impacting other endangered species as well that are not necessarily covered in this output. It's just something to bear in mind. But what we can say is that demand for species such as tiger, rhino, leopard, pangolin, and elephants may have remained active during lockdown, throughout the pandemic, or perhaps even increased. But the issue here, the change, is that actual sale transactions may not have been logistically possible to meet this demand during the pandemic. And that's mainly because buyers have not really been able to, to physically travel. Like you and I haven't been able to travel since I don't know when. Traffickers wouldn't have been able to travel either to Africa or within Asia to conduct their business as usual due to these COVID-19 related restrictions. So we've seen that across the Mekong, tiger trade has continued throughout the pandemic, and demand for rhino in Asia has also continued. And we know that rhino horn traders continue to source and purchase rhino horn from Central and Southern Africa. And we also know that there have been shipments of ivory as well that have been going out. So it's clear that, it's not necessarily business as usual in terms of the logistics behind the illegal wildlife trade, but the demand is still very much there.
So, to digress a moment, when you say the demand is there, is the poaching carrying on at pre-virus levels, and people are simply stockpiling these natural resources in anticipation of being able to resume shipments, or is it simply a slowing down of the process between, say, the people that acquire the goods in the field and the criminals who want to get their hands on them at the other end of the supply chain? Is that a realistic assessment of what's going on, or way off?
I mean, I would say that it's been a bit difficult to come across data on poaching levels. So I would be hesitant to conclude anything about, whether or not COVID-19 has impacted or increased poaching levels for different species. But what we have seen is that there is demand. For example, there are orders that have been put into traders from consumers or from buyers in Asia for these products. And it's just that they haven't really necessarily, think about it this way, they haven't necessarily been able to go out and actually physically pick up their goods. So they've put in the order, they haven't been able to pick up the goods. And we have noticed that stockpiling has also increased. So large quantities of ivory and pangolin are being stockpiled by traders in Africa mainly, in anticipation of increased buyer interest, but also buyer mobility once travel restrictions are lifted.
I know you and your colleagues, our colleagues right throughout EIA, have found that obviously the last 7 months has been a particularly massive change in the way that we do our jobs. I think we're fortunate to be in a position that most of our jobs are still able to be done remotely and working from home. I mean, for example, I know that a lot of our investigators are having to do, remote research from desktop based. Or working through our partners vicariously in the countries we'd normally be in person. These kind of serious travel restrictions have obviously made a massive impact on us. What kind of impacts have they meant for the transportation of contraband itself? Have you, in your research, have you found any indications that they're changing the way they move stuff around, and also the way they do business?
Yeah, so definitely. So I just touched upon it in your previous question, but I think a major impact of these travel restrictions that we've seen throughout lockdown has been that the majority of Asian buyers who would usually travel to source countries to buy and to conduct business in person, they've been unable to do so. And we actually think that a number of these buyers would have actually traveled back home to Vietnam and to China for Lunar New Year in February, only to become stuck there when travel restrictions were then introduced. And as a result of this reduced buyer mobility, we've seen a couple of different trends pop up that mark a shift in how wildlife trafficking dynamics have potentially changed during coronavirus times. And the main one I would say is that, again, as I just touched on, traders in Africa are thought to be stockpiling large quantities of ivory and pangolin scales, indicating that they expect and they're anticipating buyer interest and mobility and capacity to undertake physical transactions to grow again once the restrictions are lifted. And our intel suggests that some traffickers have already begun sending out shipments using the sea route. And this actually leads us to believe that demand for ivory is picking up already, and that the logistics are perhaps already falling back into place. But secondly, and this is probably, as you mentioned, the most relatable for us all in these corona times, is that traders in West and Central Africa, as well as in the Mekong region, like everyone else around the world these days, they've had to adapt to the pandemic to secure buyers. So by that, I mean that we're aware that traders are increasingly working from home, like you and I. They're using WhatsApp, they're using social media to not only organize and complete their trade deals, because that's in essence nothing new. We know that social media has been a tool of choice of wildlife traffickers in the past. But what's different now, we find, is that they are using social media to actively locate and secure new buyers. So up until now, it's been quite unusual for traffickers in Africa to sell to mainly Vietnamese and Chinese buyers without a meeting in person first. A lot of these transactions are trust-based. So essentially what we've seen is that COVID-19 travel restrictions have forced traffickers to become more trusting of unknown online customers if they're going to pin down any sales during this lockdown. So this just shows how flexible criminals can be, even in the face of increased risk, and that they will adapt their modus operandi in the pursuit of profit in this illegal business. And one thing I'd also add here is that working from home in this way for them has, exposed them to a much wider clientele. It means that traders are potentially dealing with more people, a lot more interested buyers, a lot more interested customers than they would have done previously. And this is worrying for obvious reasons, meaning that we will be looking at this, we'll be monitoring this to see whether there'll be an increase in illegal wildlife trade once Corona settles down a bit. Because this is going to have an associated impact on the pressures that endangered species will be facing. So it's something that we really need to keep an eye on. But lastly, a third trend I think that we spotted from our data is that there's been logistical difficulties in, shipping out large quantities of wildlife contraband. So one thing to note is that organized wildlife traffickers, they will, a lot of the time, especially for ivory and pangolin, they will opt to send out large shipments of contraband rather than smaller shipments here and there for various reasons, mainly financial. But now that's proven difficult. And traffickers, we've noted, are starting to opt to use courier services to shuttle smaller quantities of ivory to Asia from Africa. And again, this is highlighting that they're willing to adapt to the new normal, and it also clearly shows that there is clearly a demand still for ivory on the destination side in Asia.
Would these be commercially, legal courier service? So are we talking about courier services as in someone acting as a courier, but not legitimately?
Well, exactly. So what I mean by that is established courier companies, which obviously I don't think we can name.
Yeah, understandably.
Yeah.
Not at this point, anyway.
Not at this point, no. But they're using, again, it just goes to show that traffickers make use of established means of trade and of communication and travel in pre-lockdown days. So it's something definitely that's quite worrying, and we will be keeping an eye on.
And I'm guessing, and this is purely supposition, feel free to obviously tell me I'm totally wrong, but if they're using courier services in a way that they haven't been using them in the past, would the assumption there be that the courier services aren't exactly on the ball at knowing what to look for? If they're suddenly becoming a significant conduit for illegal wildlife products, would they not necessarily be versed enough in what to look for to actually identify it?
Well, there is that. I think it would be unfair to state that all courier services are unaware of their responsibilities in this respect. But I think there are fewer, checks in place within the courier service industry than there are, for example, at airports or at ports. So I think there's also the possibility that smaller quantities can get through easier using courier services.
Okay, so maybe we're going to have to start naming some of them down the line.
Maybe.
Moving on to and corruption, as you know, is a cornerstone of the illegal wildlife trade everywhere. It's one of the key side effects of it, and one of the things that helps drive it. Has this recent research suggested there's been any change in that respect? Obviously, the structures of societies internationally have changed in that the people you would need to pay off once upon a time, maybe you don't need to pay off now. I mean, have you noticed anything like that, or is it otherwise still business as usual?
So, short answer would be corruption is very much still present, even during COVID-19 times. And I think it's interesting. It's important here to flag that, a major component of EI's work throughout the years and throughout the different campaigns has been to highlight, how devastating corruption can be in facilitating illegal wildlife trade, and other forms of environmental crime, of course. And corruption plays a role at each stage of the illegal trade chain. So this could be anything from poaching to the transportation to the processing to the export and sale of illegal wildlife contraband. So, I mean, what I've tried to demonstrate up until now is that COVID-19 has altered certain dynamics of illegal wildlife trade, perhaps temporarily. I mean, I think it's a bit too soon to tell how long-lasting these impacts will be. But one thing that hasn't changed during Corona times, and we can comfortably say that this is very much still a feature of illegal wildlife trade in 2020, is that lockdown and corruption still very much go hand in hand. And if anything, wildlife traffickers are actually making more use of corruption because they need extra support to ship out their goods. They need extra support from the corrupt officers at ports, at airports, or at land borders to do so. And we know, for example, that though some traffickers have faced increased logistical issues to transport their goods, we also know that some, are even more willing to engage with port staff who are more willing to take bribes now during Corona times because of the economic hardships imposed on them by Corona lockdown. And our intelligence suggests that the only thing that perhaps may have changed with regards to corruption facilitating legal wildlife trade during Corona is that it may have changed the speed at which corruption can facilitate illegal transactions. So if that makes sense, it basically means that there may be fewer staff physically present in offices or at ports or at sites, at land borders, because of lockdown. Just like you and I were working from home, a lot of people have orders to be locked down and working from home as well. So it may be that illegal wildlife transactions are happening at a slower rate than usual, but they are very much still happening, and corruption is still very much pivotal in facilitating these illegal transactions.
Okay. Finally, looking to a future when the world emerges from this pandemic, and I do hope it's sooner rather than later. Do you anticipate any long-term changes in the way that wildlife crime will be conducted going forward beyond that? I know you mentioned earlier that you see working from home and the different ways of doing things and using shipping services as a sort of a stopgap throughout the rest of the pandemic. Do you imagine that when it's all over, or it begins to go back to a new normality, we're going to find the old ways working hand in hand with the new ways they've discovered?
I think that's a very interesting question. But one thing I would caveat is that, as we've all come to understand, this COVID-19 situation is so fast moving and it's quite uncertain. So I don't think we can really draw any concrete conclusions yet as to the long-lasting changes that Corona may have brought about on illegal wildlife trade. But what I will say is that, given the intelligence that we do have, mainly relating to the fact that traffickers have continued to stockpile large quantities of ivory and pangolin, we must be vigilant about a potential uptick in illegal wildlife trade once restrictions are lifted worldwide, once borders are fully open, and once it becomes, in essence, logistically easier to conduct illegal business. And I think similarly, the team at EIA is quite concerned to note that working from home, as I said, will have potentially expanded traffickers' customer base, and the risk of increased future sales is therefore real. So I think when you mentioned whether, these new changes will play hand in hand with how traffickers, once upon a time used to operate pre-COVID, I think we will see maybe a shift to online platforms more and more. And this mainly because, it exposes them to a wider clientele, as I keep saying. And I think this is, unless, authorities and relevant agencies take a proactive approach and monitor the situation as the pandemic evolves and as restrictions are eased, endangered species really will continue to face pressures from poaching and trafficking in this regard.
Okay, well, sobering stuff indeed. Rachel, thank you very much for joining us today and sharing the findings of your research.
Thanks very much for having me.
It's been a delight. Now, if you've enjoyed listening to this podcast, please watch this space for future episodes and check out our website at eia-international.org to find out more about our work. Thank you very much for joining us today, and wherever you are, stay safe out there.